Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.
Her openness and her capacity for risk-taking is really, really exciting.
She was the first ever black woman to have a solo show at the Whitechapel Gallery, the first black woman to be acquired by the Tate Collection, and then more recently, shockingly, is still the first black woman to become a Royal Academician.
Sonia is an agent actively changing forms of representation.
Oh, she's undoubtedly one of the most prominent women artists working in the UK.
I am quite hooked on the mystery of what happens when people are together and what they do.
British artist Sonia Boyce is about to stage a performance at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London for a major new artwork. She's invited a vocalist and dancers to perform in front of a masked audience. All the action will be filmed by Sonia's 4-person camera crew, but even she has no idea how it will unfold.
Nobody really quite knows what's going to happen. It's going to be maybe a little bit chaotic. I'm hoping that the dancers will kind of tease out an engagement with the audience. When people kind of do things together, particularly when they're unexpected, there's always a moment where there's something, almost like a eureka moment that kind of happens. I think there's a certain kind of energy for me that comes when I step back a bit and allow others to let the process kind of unfold.
Yeah, there's going to be 70 people wearing masks, the audience, and I felt very much like creating a sort of playground, and that there would be objects and bodies.
Collaboration and improvisation are very much Sonia's style. She works with the element of chance, bringing people together to create performance and video works that span film, music and dance. But Sonia made her first artistic mark in a very different medium, drawing. She was born in 1962 in London's East End to parents who had recently emigrated from the Caribbean.
So I'm one of 5 children, and grew up in a Caribbean household, which was very, very noisy, and the house seems to be kind of on the move. I was always drawing, and I never noticed that I was always drawing. All the margins of all my school books, and any surface that I could kind of find, I would be drawing on it.
Sonia studied at prestigious art school Stourbridge College of Art.
And so when I was on my first year at Stourbridge, I was convinced that someone in a suit would come in with a clipboard and say, are you Miss Boyce? I'm sorry you've made this terrible mistake, because I was really shocked that I was allowed to draw all day.
She decided she wanted to make art that depicted her own view of the world.
I said to myself, that's what I want to do. That's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to do fine art because I want to do work about life, but also with a very kind of edgy political sensibility. I began by looking at images in magazines, and became very aware that the images of African diasporic women, or black women, were very limited. To look through the art magazines, to look through the books, and most of what I could find were books about traditional African tribal art, or what people felt able to say primitive art.
I think that's really what gravitated her towards being an artist, is a means to sort of create a space that allowed her voice and her own personal experiences to be heard.
It's really about inserting herself into these kinds of histories, into these kinds of debates, to really kind of redress the balance of art history.
Her politically charged drawings tackled issues of identity and belonging face on. She placed herself in the centre of her work, weaving visual metaphors and puns into her colourful imagery. One of her best-known works from the period re-examines British history.
I was really into William Morris wallpapers, and then there was a wallpaper that was designed to commemorate Queen Victoria's 50th anniversary of ruling the empire. And in this wallpaper was the various continents, the 4 continents that the British Empire ruled over. I used that as a kind of background to kind of talk about both the church's relationship in terms of empire, the question about colonialism.
It's very human, it's dealing with sort of very personal issues, and yet it's kind of being presented in this very confident, sort of very heroic scale as well.
I mean, her titles are just so fantastic and so evocative, and they raise all sorts of questions.
You see her on the right-hand panel kind of looking out at the viewer slightly impassively, and behind her are these kinds of Tudor roses, but they're all turned black. They're entangled with these cruciform shapes. In each one of them is a name of a different colony. And so thinking about these different legacies of empire, thinking about the ways in which empire is completely intertwined with the way in which histories and narratives get built.
The rose itself is a kind of ambivalent motif, beautiful, fragile, but also thorny, intractable. And that sense of ambivalence is there throughout Sonia's work. We look at William Morris now as sort of representative of quintessential English artists, and yet William Morris was an anarchist. You know, he was actually very disruptive in his own right. And I think there is a synergy there between a figure like William Morris, who's interrogating and engaged with questions of Englishness and representation, and Sonia Boyce working 100 years later and interrogating those same themes, but from a very different experience and in a very different context.
The Arts Council of Britain bought the pastel. They were swiftly followed by Tate, who acquired 2 other works, making Sonia, aged just 23, the first black female artist and only the 5th woman in Tate's collection.
It's worth pointing out that not every artist sort of ends up being in national collections at that early point.
I was 23. I mean, this is just, it's kind of crazy. We were very, very aware of there being, that the status quo was there to be challenged, was not there to tell us, okay, this is what you think and you just follow it. That it was, you know, that it was our job, in a way, to challenge things.
Sonia's performance has just wrapped. Rather than lasting half an hour as predicted, it went on for 2 hours as the audience became more involved, eagerly responding to Sonia's invitation to play.
I mean, we wanted the performers to get the audience members involved, but I didn't realise the extent to which they would really people just wanted to play.
We didn't know what to expect, and we were worried the whole time that people wouldn't do anything. And actually the opposite happened, that through the course of the performance and what unfolded is we actually couldn't get the audience to stop. So they sort of became very involved and it continued. And that's what's fascinating, and that was the confidence and the trust that Sonia had in that she knew something would happen. The mask, I think, did operate in the way that Sonia hoped, in which there was a sort of letting go that took place during the course of the performance.
She used her own portrait, but it's not quite clear that it's Sonia, and created these masks which she gave to the audience so that they had a license to enter into the work, to participate, without being identifiable or, I suppose, exposed.
As an experience, that was just totally off the charts. I'm actually beaming, thinking that was quite extraordinary.
Britain in the early 80s was quite a bitter, embattled place. Thatcher had recently come to power, unemployment was on the up. You'd had the rioting in Liverpool, Brixton, Southall, so it was quite an edgy place.
Born out of this tumultuous time, the Black Arts movement was started by young people fighting for their place in society.
So in 1980s Britain, the idea of a mainstream, homogenous British identity was something that was being challenged by a whole range of artists and filmmakers and writers. And it was into this context that Sonia emerged, amongst a group who were really giving voice to a different notion, an idea of what it was to be British. And it was a very, very exciting time.
She was a key part of a sort of very activist Black Arts movement. It was about ideas and how you can articulate messages that needed to be heard more widely.
The idea that a bunch of young artists were going to come along who'd been brought up here and were going to use the experience of having grown up in quite a disadvantaged embattled situation on many levels and actually put that into art. I mean, that was something that the British art scene was not prepared for.
At that point, I was really wanting to make images that somehow described not only who I was, but the context from which I was coming from. One wasn't doing it in terms of thinking, oh, this is about making history or anything. It was just, yeah, okay, you know, let's just do this, without thought really about what it meant historically.
Sonia's focus on family and the domestic space shone a light on a community that, until then, was barely seen in British museums.
She ain't holding them up, she's holding on. Some English Rose is an extraordinary work. I mean, you can see already Sonia's interest in the idea of the artist as this catalyst, this trigger, this activator of narrative.
I was particularly making reference to, you know, the kind of domestic space and the particular kind of domestic space within a kind of Caribbean household, which is very, very patterned and very kind of quite sensual. There's always a lot of colour and a lot of texture.
And the work, I think, is a really key work, not just for Sonia, but also for British art, because it's the first time in the national collection of British art there is a work which is addressing what it means to be a black British woman.
Sonia's interest in black identity inspired her to make a new work about the popular fictional character Tarzan.
The piece was about kind of deconstructing not only you know, this figure of Tarzan, who, you know, is this white male who grows up in the jungle and is able to master that space better than the people who've lived there for centuries. Invariably, the black subjects that are rallied around him are indecipherable. They're unable to speak, they're incoherent, they are often stupid. They're unable to work out the things that he's managed to work out in, you know, as this lone figure. And so the piece was about kind of deconstructing all of that, all of those kinds of narratives going on as a way of trying to think through how we relate to representation.
Like a lot of Sonia's work at the time, this is really thinking about how is identity produced? How is identity constructed? How is gender constructed? And to this, she often turns to collage. And this kind of pick-and-mix approach, she does particularly deftly, I think, in From Tarzan to Rambo. And there's a certain kind of level of performance here, the way in which the self becomes performed.
So the reason why I was using collage, in a way, it was my pathway into thinking about the moving image and actually creating moving images, working with collage.
It would have been easy for Sonia to continue working in this way, but ever restless and curious for new things, from this point on she started to work exclusively in video and performance.
Kind of no longer wanted to start off with a kind of clear narrative, so to speak. And I suppose I realised in doing some of that work, where I was the centre of the work, that actually I found it much more interesting for other people to kind of take that kind of centre stage.
Just as some of those early works were different expressions of identity or investigations into identity, what performance and moving image allowed her to do was to approach these kinds of questions with other people. It was her allowing a degree of chance, of improvisation, and importantly of collaboration into the work too. So it's a way of kind of opening the work out onto the world.
Actually, I think that her true medium is people. You know, it's working with people and it's working with others, and that actually video and sound offers that kind of forum to sort of work in the kind of way that now suits her and the way she wants to express her ideas.
By working with video, Sonia continued to explore different perspectives, but was now able to look at diversity in music and sound too. In For You, Only You, Sonia took on the challenge of bringing the avant-garde sound art of Mikhail Karikis to a completely unfamiliar context, Oxford University.
I was just so struck by the way that he, the the way he performs and the kind of non-linguistic use of very kind of guttural sounds, bodily sounds in his performance. Mikhail works in a very different way to, kind of Renaissance, highly structured way of singing. The choir were really troubled by what Mikhail had done with this piece of choral music by Josquin Desprez. But what Mikhail had done is he chopped it up and rearranged so that there were half sentences and it was familiar and unfamiliar to them.
You have this extraordinary kind of dance that goes on between these two pieces of sound and music, the choir singing and Mikhail Karikas' improvised sound piece, which is guttural. It sounds like animal noises. That piece is very much about how we receive and understand something that's different, that's unfamiliar, that's strange, and how we open ourselves up to actually embracing that difference. And it's a very resonant piece in terms of the times we live in, the question of how we embrace the stranger, the foreigner, the unfamiliar is a key question for our times.
And actually it's continued to make me think about what representation not only might look like, but also might sound like.
Sonia started looking at black female singers in Britain. She was captivated by the story of little-known singer Adelaide Hall.
Adelaide was a singer in the 1930s. She knew Duke Ellington, and she made one of the earliest jazz scat records with Duke Ellington, which is a piece of which we use at the end of this film, Oh Adelaide.
So the piece is very much also about what's visible, what we acknowledge culturally, what's part of a shared history and narrative of our shared culture, and what gets eclipsed, what gets forgotten.
Sonia is tackling the footage from the performance at the ICA. Her challenge is to shape a huge amount of material into the final artwork.
There's stuff and there's bodies and it's all kind of... And then you've got this really hard sound. My whole imagining has kind of expanded and multiplied to try and think about how to kind of capture a sense of it without trying to do it's not like a documentary of what took place. It's really how to make something from all that material. It's like sculpting really, but it's sculpting with kind of the video material and the sound material. There's always risk. There's always risk with the things that I do. I am looking for things that are going to surprise me. But also I'm very seriously interested in how other people respond. And I want to be surprised by my own practice. I don't want to say, all right, I do this and I do this every day. I'm not that kind of artist who's very systematic. And I'm wanting it to be a kind of journey of discovery in a way.
Always fascinated by the unpredictable nature of improvisation, British artist Sonia Boyce took on a new project at the Villa Arson, a renowned art school in the hills behind Nice.
So the site is stunning. All of the wonder of surrealism is kind of built into that space. And I wanted to work with the students, and it was chaotic, and it was tremendously energising. I think it released something in the students, in everybody actually. And by the end of it, the students basically were leading what was happening, and they were making these most extraordinary animal sounds. And it was hilarious, but really spooky. And there isn't a... I don't know why that happened, but it just did. It just kind of rose to the surface.
Rather than projecting what might happen, she's genuinely interested to see what might happen, and then that's the material that she then uses for her artwork.
Once again, she's activating the artwork by creating the space, by bringing these people together and then wants to see what happens, is trusting in the process of collaboration, of bringing different people together.
It's opening night at London's ICA, and Sonia's new work is about to go on show. The finished artwork spans 2 rooms with 7 different screens and specially designed wallpaper, inviting visitors into the space.
So we're the first day of the actual exhibition of the work, although we didn't start out thinking about it as a kind of multi-screened installation. Because there were so many angles from which the performance was filmed, started to wonder, well, is it possible then to do something that happens simultaneously across different screens? I mean, also the idea of not having one perspective, you know, that there are multiple perspectives on any given situation, and that's really, in terms of trying to configure the installation, trying to think about people having not being able to see everything all at once. It's not all laid out for everybody. You have to kind of move in order to get a sense of that there are these different things going on. People might engage with each other. You know, I don't know what will happen in this space over the period of its exhibition.
I think the initial impression of it is quite unfathomable. I mean, you've got 6 viewpoints unfolding simultaneously. You don't quite know which one you're supposed to be looking at and in what order. But gradually you're kind of surrounded by the experience of this performance, almost as though you're part of it yourself.
Although it's not sort of foregrounded in the work, it was against a backdrop of quite extraordinary political social times. So at the heart of this work is the idea of, you know, the titles "We Move in Her Way," which can be read either positive or negative, whether that's an enabling factor or an obstructive factor, but against a backdrop of really what, for a new generation, are sort of concerning issues about the idea of a woman in power and how that is then regarded in the media. That actually provided a backdrop in a way that also kind of gave it sort of an extra resonance as well.
And I think Sonia was particularly drawn to this idea of an artist who was not making objects, but was actually creating environments and triggering the participation of the audience in a very dynamic and interesting way. And it broke down the barrier between an artist and a viewer. The audience actually has a very active role to play in completing the artwork.
I think art is a place that doesn't take us away from life. It's not a kind of place of fantasy or escape or removal. It's actually a lens that brings us closer to the world. So I think the artist Sonia Boyce, in all of her complexity, is really starting to emerge in a new way.
You know, it's very important to recognise that Sonia's work has consistently broken boundaries and been at the vanguard of forms of artistic practice in Britain, and has been extraordinarily influential.
I am quite hooked on what, you know, the mystery of what happens when people are together and what they do, and that's why I work this way. You know, I don't know that me sitting in the studio on my own would ever produce anything like that. And always there's something unexpected. I never know what's going to come around the corner.
Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.